you for joining and thank you for joining the Ohio Legislative Children's Caucus for their monthly webinar. If you do not know, my name is Representative Humphrey, and I am the co-chair along with Senator Kunze of the Ohio Children's Caucus, a bipartisan, bicameral, issues-based caucus dedicated to championing for children's issues in the state legislature. Now, today we are going to hear about the budget and the state of children in Ohio. We will discuss the 2023 Kids Count Data Book, a 50-state report of recent household data developed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, analyzing how children and families are faring. The data book looks at data from 5 different categories, including economic well-being, education, health, and family and community, and then rates each state underneath each category. We will be reviewing how Ohio ranks regarding each category in comparison to other states. We will hear from Kim Eckhart, a policy associate with the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio, Jory Novotny, the Ohio Association of Food Banks with the Ohio Association of Food Banks, and Tim Johnson at the Ohio Poverty Law Center. At the end of the webinar, now we will open up for questions. Please let it be known that legislators, legislative aides, and any agency people on the webinar will have first chance to ask questions. Now, for everyone else on the webinar, please type your questions in the Q&A section, and we will address them. Now, our first speaker today will be Ms. Kim Eckhart, again, a policy associate with the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio. Kim is going to walk us through the Ohio section of the 2023 Kids Count data release. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me, Rep. Humphrey. Yeah, we at the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio, we have been in partnership with Annie E. Casey Foundation for over 30 years to be a part of their Kids Count program. And so every state has the opportunity to collaborate with them to really take an evidence and data approach to measuring child well-being. And I love the timing of this data book's release this year. It was released on June 15th, and we are proceeding the final negotiations of our budget book, our budget for this biennium. And so I really feel like this sets us up to be able to really see how does Ohio compare nationally to other states. So let's look at where is Ohio when we look at us across the entire nation. And really the surprising thing, I think, is, that Ohio is in the bottom half of the nation. I say surprising because I really believe that we have the capacity and the potential to be a leader. We are a very populous state. We are a state that has a lot of universities and just a very robust population. And I would love to see us do better for our children. There's no reason for us to be in the bottom half. So we did say there are 4 different domains that we look at, and then we have an overall rank as well. And you can see that we have, relative to the other states, we're doing relatively well in the education space. And in family and community, that's where we're really struggling. So let's look at and just dive in a little bit more to what these different domains actually measure. So we'll start with economic well-being. Each of these domains has 4 different measures, right? And so this picture gives you a snapshot of not only where we are in comparison with the national average, but also comparing ourselves to our benchmark, which this year we're looking at 2019. So you can see that in terms of economic well-being, we have 475,000 children living in poverty. And I don't even really think that fully captures the scale of economic hardship, because as you know, that measure of poverty is that federal poverty level. And we know that families that are around that income level are also struggling. So And it's not getting better. During in 2021, we actually increased in terms of the percentage of children living in poverty. There's other areas that we could address, but as you can see, really the only thing that we're looking a little bit better in is that high housing cost burden, which is above 30% of a person's income. So let's look at the next domain, which is in education. And again, this is one where we're actually doing relatively well. But the bad news is that we're actually getting worse if we're just comparing to ourselves. So you can see, that this really drastically has changed in terms of the proficiency levels. 8th graders in math, this is a stark reality. This is the number of students who are not proficient in math. So a higher percentage is actually getting worse. And we can see too that we're getting worse in terms of the number of young children who are not in school. And we have learned so much about how early learning experiences really set students up for success as in their school years. And so this also is, concerning. And no spoilers here, but the state could do so much better in terms of childcare. So I know we have some people that have talked a lot about this, but when you're thinking about the budget and you're thinking about this measure of young children who are not in school, I think there's some really clear connections here. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look at health. And this also has 4 different measures that combine into this domain of health. And what we're really concerned about at Children's Defense Fund is the 2 at the top, which are the low birth weight babies, which, those have a lot to do with health in, later stages, as well as children without health insurance. And again, there's so many clear ties to initiatives that have been introduced into the budget that we could be doing a lot better, but this shows that, in fact, we're going in the wrong direction. We are higher than the nation, we're worse off than the nation, and we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of low birth weight babies. Now, fortunately, children without health insurance, I think a big part of this has been the reason why it's the same is that we have seen during the pandemic and the public health emergency provisions that allowed us to have children continuously enrolled were super beneficial in this area. But what we do know is that that's going away. And so I'm hoping that what we can do with this budget is ensure that that doesn't go away completely, especially for those youngest children, those children who really need to see their pediatrician regularly so that they can get all of their immunizations and have those well checks and early diagnoses. Next slide. The last measure, again, this one we are actually improving on, even though we have a long way to go, being 33rd in the nation. And the thing that I really want to highlight in this slide is the children in single parent families. And the reason for this is the connection between families who have a single income and child poverty. And if you think about how difficult it is to both earn an income and provide and look after young children who are not school age yet, it's very challenging. And if this is an area where that issue of childcare and really making childcare accessible could go such a long way in reducing child poverty. So let's go to the next slide. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, every year they choose a different theme to focus on. And in addition to the state rankings, which we can count on every year, they focus in on an area that is of national importance, and it's also very important in Ohio, as many of you know. And so what they did was they really took a deep dive into the costs of childcare relative to our income, but then also looking at how it affects us in terms of how we change jobs. So you can see here that, going back to that idea of 36% of all children living in single parent homes, of those, it can take 30% of your income if you're in a home-based childcare center versus a center-based childcare is almost 40% of their income. So you can imagine the ramifications in terms of how this impacts families who have young children and are really trying to make ends meet. So we can move on to the next slide. So the last, piece I want to say is we have tried to kind of make these connections between the state of child well-being in Ohio and the decisions that we make in the policy landscape that we collectively get to create in our state. And so, and I'm so grateful for the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition for really helping us to frame how the different decisions that the budget throughout the budget process. So we tried to capture this kind of framework by saying there are issues that we think will really move the needle on those measures of child well-being. I think a perfect example of this is, providing Medicaid coverage of doula services and having that low birth weight babies measure go down. So we were so thrilled to see some provisions in the House that then were taken out of the Senate. So this resource is a map to show how each of those different issues can map out to really improving child well-being across the state. And I would love to see Ohio continue to move up in the ranks until we are a leading state. And I think we have many leaders in our state. The people on this Children's Caucus, I think all agree that we can do more to invest in children and families. We just need to get there, and we are in the final stretch. So hopefully we can come to an agreement about those key priorities. So my colleague is going to share with you the resource which you can look to. I don't want to steal anybody's thunder because we're going to talk about some specific things that can happen in the budget. But there's a great resource out there that maps all of this out in terms of the investments that we could be making to really move the needle on those child well-being measures. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'll welcome questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was a wonderful presentation. At this time, we are going to be hearing from Jory Novotny with the Ohio Association of Food Banks. Jory?
Thank you, Rep. Humphrey and Co-Chair Senator Coonsey and the other members of the Legislative Children's Caucus, as well as the Children's Budget Coalition, for having me today. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you about what we're seeing in terms of child and family food security, the state of what that looks like in Ohio, and then how the state budget can still help in these final stages of compromises and decision making. So I wanted to share with you some results of a recent survey that we conducted. And just to go back and remind everyone briefly what we were staring down the barrel of coming up here in early spring, late winter of this year. For 3 years during the pandemic, some of the lowest income food insecure Ohioans were receiving SNAP emergency allotments, which meant that they were receiving the maximum allotment size for their household size during the pandemic. For many families, that meant about an average of $200 per month for a family of 3, for example, about $90 a person extra in SNAP benefits to buy groceries at the grocery store each month. In total, in Ohio, that was more than $126 million per month in additional 100% federally funded food assistance benefits to help folks navigate all of the pressure that they were under during the pandemic, especially because, our elected officials at every level saw very early on the ramifications that the public and economic crises were, public health and economic crises were having on food security in particular. So in the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed by Congress at the end of last year, the SNAP emergency allotments were decided to be early sunset. And so the last payment of those went out at the end of February. So beginning in March, we saw 1.5 million Ohioans who currently participate in SNAP lose collectively $126 million or more per month. So we wanted to take stock of what was what was affecting them, and also to see what other pressure food bank clients that we're serving across the state have been facing, given that we've been under 16, 18 months of record inflation and particularly high costs for food and other basic consumer goods that affect low and moderate income families the most. So we conducted a statewide survey, an anonymous survey of more than 2,000 food bank clients representing about a third of all zip codes across the state. And I wanted to share some of those highlights with you today. So a quick demographic look at what I just should say this is a representative sample of our clientele we surveyed from April 14th through May 7th. So this was after a full 2 months of having lost those SNAP emergency allotments. Maybe there had been a little bit of savings to cushion that blow for a month or so, but this is after families had absorbed that for a full couple of months. We found that close to a half of all households that we serve at Ohio's food banks have at least one member under 18, and nearly 4 in 10 include at least one person with a disability. Next slide. We asked folks about what tough choices they're making, and they shared that in the last 2 to 3 months, more than 2/3 had to choose between affording enough food on their own or putting gas in the car to get to work. 2/3 had to choose between affording food or utilities, a very common trade-off that we see often being made. More than half had to choose between food or medicine or healthcare, and half had to choose between food and housing. Food is often something that many families sacrifice at the end of the month. As you know, we talk about this often, that food is the thing that no one's going to come and collect a bill on. You don't get your food shut off like you do a utility bill. You can skip a meal and still go to work, but you can't get to work without gas in your car, etc. But it's really troubling because we know that making that choice has horrible ramifications for all of what I just mentioned. So next slide. Some other findings that were really troubling for us, and I want to contextualize this just to state that we know that kids are part of families, right? And you all know that. And so we tend not to ask parents and caregivers directly about what choices they're having to make for their children, because that can be really uncomfortable, of course, for them. They want to do right by their kids. Everyone does. So we ask these questions specifically in terms of what adults and households are doing to get by. Our survey found that 2 in 3 of Ohio Food Bank clients had adults in their household that cut the size of meals or skipped meals in the last 12 months because there wasn't enough money for food, including more than 1 in 3 that said they did so almost every month over the last year. So you can imagine what that's doing for the health and well-being of adults, parents, and caregivers, and then of course the kids in the home who are not immune to the impacts of that, whether it's that they're also cutting what they're eating or, consuming food that's of less high quality, or that they can feel the emotional and financial strain impacting their family. Next slide. Thank you. So we saw that reflected in a question we asked about how folks have been feeling. More than half reported feeling down, depressed, or hopeless since March, when those SNAP emergency allotments ended and we were well into a year or more of high inflation and high food prices. More than 8 in 10 food bank clients expressed that one of the reasons they were seeking help was because of higher food costs. So we all feel that every week when we go to the grocery store, if we're fortunate enough to do that and to shop that way. And it's certainly hitting those households very hard. Next slide. We also asked about SNAP participation, of course, because we know the Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, is the first line of defense against hunger, the most important one. And I'd already talked to you about the loss of SNAP emergency allotments. So we asked folks, okay, how long were your SNAP benefits lasting when you did have the emergency allotments? And then how long are they lasting now that they've been reduced so significantly? So before the SNAP emergency allotments ended, 3 in 10 participants said that their benefits lasted the full month. But after the SNAP emergency allotments ended, just 5% of SNAP participants said their benefits lasted the full month. And in fact, more than 3 in 4 now say that their benefits are exhausted in 2 weeks or less. We also found that only about 4 in 10 of food bank clients are participating in SNAP. And that's because food banks serve households up to 200% of the federal poverty level, which is a widely accepted self-sufficiency standard. And we're seeing a lot of clients that are between 130% of the federal poverty level, which is Ohio's initial income eligibility threshold for SNAP, and 200%, which is the maximum eligibility level for food bank assistance. So then we ask folks, what are they going to experience coming up? If they can predict what the next 2 months looks like for them, would they rely on us more often, less often, or about the same? 37% said they expected to rely on Ohio food banks more often in the next 2 months, and just 5% said that they would rely on us less often. So I want to talk about kind of what that means for families and kids in Ohio. Just to contextualize this, child food insecurity rates in 2021, when those SNAP emergency allotments were available and advanced expanded child tax credits were available at the federal level for families, child food insecurity was about 14.8%, which was actually down compared to pre-pandemic. Those benefits were incredibly important to not driving down the official poverty rate that Kim mentioned, that's based on household income and wages, but the supplemental poverty measure, taking into account this additional support that families with kids were receiving. Child poverty fell drastically while those investments were in place. And now we're in we're in the world of post-SNAP emergency allotments, the end of the advanced expanded child tax credits. And, this is what our kids and families are facing now. Really tough choices with their budgets and their spending power. So just briefly, I just want to quickly review what opportunities we have in the state budget to do right by families with kids, to pass a budget that aligns with the reality that they're facing. We need this to invest in access to food and other basic needs. So next slide. Just to review what we're looking for and recommending to you, your members and staff. In the House budget, $15 million in additional funding was included to support the Ohio Food Program and Agricultural Clearance Program. This is a signature program we've been operating in public-private partnership with the state of Ohio and several general assemblies and administrations that rescues food from the fields, as well as driving shelf-stable and center-of-the-plate foods to food banks across the state to serve people in need, to fill those emergency gaps, and to stretch budgets. And that additional funding was stripped out of the Senate version of the budget. So we urge the inclusion of that $15 million additional funding per year in the final version of the budget. Next slide. We also want to emphasize that, kids need access to nutrition year round. And we were really excited as part of, the Hunger Free Ohio Schools Coalition, that funding was included in the House version of the budget to offset the cost of reduced price school meals. So these are for, kids in working families that fall between 130 and 185% of the federal poverty level. They weren't paying for that reduced price cost of meals during the pandemic, thanks to Congress's action. And that has since ended. And now those families are having to pay, their share of the reduced price meal. This is a really smart investment all around. It's a win-win-win. It was included by the House and it should be included in the final budget. And then I also wanted to mention that there are several changes that have been proposed in the Senate's version of the budget that would severely reduce, limit, and weaken eligibility for and access to SNAP. And what I really want to hit home, and I'll just refer you to the technical kind of background on these, is that anything that puts up additional barriers for any of the SNAP caseload, whether that be families with kids or not, slows down the cogs of that wheel for everyone. And our system is already very close to the breaking point. We have counties and a call center that is drastically behind on answering calls in a timely fashion. And to really stay in line with federal regulations and to serve people who are in need, we need to streamline access to this fully federally funded benefit, instead of putting up any additional sort of hoops that any part of the population needs to go through, because the same caseworkers that are now redetermining Medicaid eligibility, as Kim was talking about, are also looking at these SNAP cases. And every decision that is made to weaken access to SNAP makes it more difficult for everyone looking for that help to get it. Next slide. So I know I'm a little bit over time. Just quickly want to particularly emphasize that there is a SNAP photo ID measure that was added in the Omni by the Senate. This has been debated several times in session. We and other advocates have provided a wealth of testimony in opposition to this measure before. We'd be happy to talk with anyone interested in learning more about why this is unhelpful, costly, and actually deters participation, especially for families with kids. Imagine that you're a 16-year-old who lives in a household on SNAP. What you do to contribute is your mom sends you to the grocery store with your EBT card. Now your mom's picture is on the card, and you, the 16-year-old, is getting asked, by the cashier, "What's up? Is this really your card?" That's not an experience that any child of any age should have to experience. So that's how families shop, and we don't recommend spending millions of dollars, on that initiative. So I already stated what our priorities are. We urge Governor DeWine and the Conference Committee to fully fund statewide hunger relief at our full request of $39.55 million per year. Please reinstate the investment in reduced price school meals for Ohio students and remove those harmful SNAP provisions to encourage access to federally funded food assistance benefits, which is key for supporting working families with kids. And with that, I will turn it back over to Rep. Humphrey. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jory. It was really insightful. Now, at this time, we're going to have Mr. Tim Johnson, the Senior Policy Advocate with the Ohio Poverty Law Center. Tim?
Thank you, Representative Humphrey, and good afternoon, everybody in attendance. Would also like to give a shout out to the Legislative Children's Caucus, the Children's Defense Fund, the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition, and all the staff who helped make this presentation today possible. My name is Tim Johnson, and I'm going to be going over the lead poisoning prevention provisions in the Ohio budget and sort of where things stand and sort of where we need to go from here. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. Just want to quickly shout out the Ohio Lead-Free Kids Coalition. This is a group that I help co-chair. It is a coalition of advocates, parents, organizations who all spend their time dedicated to making sure that Ohio is a place where children can grow up happy, healthy, and free from lead poisoning hazards. And so encourage folks who are interested in the coalition to feel free to research it, and if you're interested, join. Next slide. And then also just want to boost the Lead-Free Kids Coalition's 9-point action plan that they put out in February of 2020, right before the entire world seemed to grind to a halt and things stopped. But this came out and really has a lot of detail of policies and things that the state of Ohio can implement over the next several years to help get us to a place where all children grow up in an Ohio that is free from lead poisoning hazards. Next slide. All right, so the problem, what is lead poisoning? Why is it important? Why is it serious? Just want to make sure that everybody understands that lead is a toxin, and there's absolutely no safe level of lead to have in your bloodstream. So lead has a variety of effects, which we will talk about shortly. And any lead in the bloodstream is harmful to a child, especially to a child. It's harmful to anybody, but it has some pretty significant and serious implications for children who end up with lead in the bloodstream. The number one source of lead poisoning in the state of Ohio is lead paint, especially lead dust from old lead paint in housing, built before 1978 when lead poisoning was outlawed. So in 1978, it was made illegal to use lead paint in homes. But unfortunately, just because we outlawed lead paint doesn't mean that all the paint that already existed just magically went away in these old homes. And Ohio has a specifically unique challenge in this, in that 2/3 of our housing stock was built before 1980. And we have an estimated nearly 500,000 kids under the age of 6 who are living in these older homes that have these lead hazards in them. So it is a danger for kids to be in these homes, and we have quite a few of them. And every county has them. I find myself saying all the time to legislators and advocates and folks that I talk to, Lead poisoning is not a urban problem. It's not a suburban problem. It's not a rural problem. It's an Ohio problem. So whether you live in a urban county where you have a lot of older concentrated housing, or whether you live in a rural county where even though the houses are most spread out, they have a lot of older homes that were built in the early 19th and 20th century. There is no county that is free from lead hazards in the state of Ohio. And that creates a problem for us. The number of kids in Ohio testing positive for elevated blood lead level is higher, double actually, than the national average. And we have the second highest rate of kids testing positive for elevated blood lead levels in the country. So it's a serious problem. Ohio is experiencing it harder than most. And so our job and our responsibility is to do what we can for kids to try to eliminate lead hazards. Next slide. Because the effects of lead poisoning are real, and they have a lifelong impact. So just because the kid is poisoned at a young age, they see effects from this throughout the entirety of their lives. Once the lead is in the bloodstream, it is there. So you see things like decreased bone and muscle growth. You can see damage to their nervous system, to their kidneys, to other organs. They often have very serious issues with speech and language. It can include things like hearing loss and other sensory issues. It also has effects on the way they develop. So developmental delays are a common occurrence. There are cognitive issues, decreased IQ, and then also some sort of symptoms like attention deficit disorder and other disorders are also possible for kids who are lead poisoned. But it's not just the physical effects or the cognitive effects you have to worry about. There are legitimate quality of life and societal effects when a child is lead poisoned. So there was a great study by Case Western Reserve University looking at sort of these downstream effects as a child develops and gets older. What are the consequences for them being poisoned by lead? We know that they have less of a chance of being on track and on time to be ready for kindergarten. They're less likely to be reading at a grade level. They're more likely to interact with the juvenile justice system as children, and then again with the adult system when they're older. They are more likely to require homeless services and other public aid. So there are real life consequences that go all the way through the rest of their lives when kids are poisoned at a young age by lead. Next slide. But I do want to spend a moment before we get onto the budget to talk about some of the progress that the General Assembly has made with lead poisoning prevention over the last few years. There has been a real effort by a lot of advocates to really make sure that legislators understand what lead poisoning does to children, why it's important we fund prevention efforts. And I would like to just thank them all for the work that they've done on House Bill 45 at the end of last year, which contained $150 million for lead poisoning prevention of American Rescue Plan Act funding. And just always want to take the opportunity to thank legislators, and they're doing very good work. And this was a huge, huge thing that they were able to do with this ARPA dollars. Because before this $150 million investment, the state had not quite seen lead poisoning prevention funding get above 10 million. So we're really happy to see that they did that. The Department of Development is spearheading this effort to really get these ARPA funds out and obligated and spent. You can see the breakdown here. There's 20 million to the Department of Health, 100 million for construction activities, that's the actual work being done to get rid of lead hazards in the home. $22.5 million for workforce development, which is very exciting to make sure that we have the workforce to actually accomplish the things that we're looking to do and build that workforce up. 4 million for contractor liaisons to work with contractors across the state, and then 3.5 million for administration. And there's a link there, and I will also drop a link in the chat for folks who want to get more information on how development and the Department of Health are working to spend those ARPA fundings. Next slide. So let's quickly talk about the budget and the things that are good in it, because I always believe, again, in shouting out when things are good and positive. So we are happy to see that investments in the Cleveland Lead Safe Home Fund were maintained. Cleveland has really been leading the way as a local community dedicated to working on lead poisoning prevention. They have their own lead safe ordinance that they have implemented. They've been receiving funding from the state to operate that, and that has continued in the budget. So we're happy to see that. They preserved the S-chip lead abatement program, which is a sort of collaboration between the Department of Medicaid and the Department of Health to use S-chip dollars to get into the home of kids before they are lead poisoned, to get rid of those lead hazards. It's supposed to be a really good primary prevention tool. They haven't been able to use it as well as they want to, but I am very glad to see funding for that has continued. They continued with the Lead Safe Home Fund, which we'll talk about what that is in a second. Supported EI early intervention funding to make sure that kids between the ages of 1 and 3 who test positive for an elevated blood lead level are able to get the services that they need. And there has been funding added in the Senate for the Historic South Initiative in Toledo, which is a program where they are taking housing in the historic South District in the city of Toledo and rehabbing those homes and making them lead safe and available for the members of the community to live in. However, there are some things in the budget that are not as good and that we do need to talk about. One was the cutting of the lead abatement line item from the executive version of the budget. It's line item 440527. It was funded at $10.4 million in FY24 and 11.6 in FY25. That was slashed in the House's funding down to 6.5 million in both fiscal years, and then raised slightly by the Senate to 7.5 million in both fiscal years, but still overall represents a cut from what Governor DeWine envisioned in his dedication to double down on his lead poisoning prevention funding. So what does that equate to? Less funding to expand the Lead Safe Home Fund, which was a fund created last budget that essentially allows for local communities to either create brand new lead safe programming in their community or expand existing lead safe programming. They had some great success with that in the last budget. They were hoping to expand that program so that more communities can take advantage of it. And unfortunately, with the funding cuts, it looks like that's not going to be something they'll be able to do. There's also less funding to the delegated health authorities around the state who handle lead casework. The state of Ohio is going to be lowering its elevated blood lead level from 5 micrograms per deciliter to 3.5 in order to catch more children earlier and offer them more services. There was funding made available on this line item to do that. And unfortunately, with the cut, it is going to be less funding to go around for those delegated health authorities to deal with the expanded caseload. Funding cuts to H2 Ohio funding, less funding for lead service replacement, lead service line replacement. So H2 Ohio funding allows for water quality projects to be done, which include lead service line replacement. Ohio has the highest number of lead service line in the nation. And so less funding for that overall means the less availability for them to do that work. Investments in the budget represents Ohio's ongoing commitment to lead poisoning prevention. And it's really where our priorities lie, and just making sure that we're continuing to fund that adequately. Next slide. And then another thing I really want to mention is the removal of the renovation, repair, and painting rule. So to give you a bit of background on what this is. The renovation, repair, and painting rule requires that contractors performing work in an older home built before 1978 be certified to do so in a manner that's lead safe. So they're not incidentally disturbing lead paint, stirring up lead dust, and then having kids breathe that in. It is a primary prevention tool that keeps kids safe on the front end. And what I mean by that is right now, the way we operate in the state of Ohio, so much of the work we do in the lead poisoning prevention area happens after a child has already been lead poisoned, which means that they have been lead poisoned. Then you get people coming out, they do inspections, they identify lead hazards, they issue lead hazard control orders and try to mitigate the harm and all those different things. But the cost of that is that a kid has been lead poisoned, and that's how we identify where the hazards are. This is a way to keep kids safe up front so they don't become lead poisoned in the first place, which is our ultimate goal and what we should be moving toward. Currently, this rule is enforced by the US EPA, and the process is muddled and haphazard. Enforcement doesn't always happen. It's very difficult for somebody to lodge a complaint if something does happen. But the EPA does allow for states to do their own enforcement, which is what Ohio is trying to do. Next slide. So Governor DeWine proposed allowing the Department of Health to take over enforcement. He did in the last budget. He did so again in this one. It will make Ohio the 15th state to adopt its own version of RRP enforcement. And there are some benefits for Ohio taking over this enforcement rather than having the EPA do it. One of them is not having unreasonable fines and fees. I mentioned earlier that the enforcement of this requirement is haphazard and it doesn't always happen, but when it does, sometimes the fines can be incredibly excessive, up to $37,000 a day in some cases. The Ohio Department of Health could tune in and really make this much more manageable for contractors and make the fines much more reasonable. It can focus on compliance over punishment. So working with our contractors to make sure they understand what their responsibilities are, what they need to be doing, how to get certified, all of those different things, rather than just deciding to come in and punish them repeatedly for violations and things like that. It can be more collaborative. And then finally, a streamlined process and dedicated resources. So there'd be somebody at the Department of Health that contractors can talk to if they have any questions. It could also help people understand where to go to if they feel like RRP has been violated. Because right now, if you want to file a complaint, it is so incredibly difficult that it would take you forever to figure out exactly where you need to go, what you need to do, what evidence you need to have, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes things easier all around for folks. Unfortunately, RRP was removed in the Senate version. And without that, we're not only rewarding bad actors and punishing the well-intentioned, we're unfortunately endangering children. What I mean by that is that there are folks in Ohio who are RRP certified right now, but when there are costs to become RRP certified, and there are costs to doing the extra things like tarping off areas and things like that as part of the requirements, folks who are not doing those things can undercut those folks. So you are harming the people who want to do right by Ohio's children, and you're also putting those children at risk of becoming lead poison. Next slide. Just want to remind folks that there is not a cost savings by shortchanging children in the budget. Every child poisoned by lead in the state of Ohio represents a policy failure, and that's a policy failure going back decades. And this has been a long time coming. We've been ignoring lead hazards for years and not taking it seriously, all the way back to the start of the 20th century when we first started finding out how harmful lead was. It was still allowed lead paint to be legal and things of that nature. And we understand that picking priorities to fund can be incredibly difficult because there are a lot of folks who have a lot of worthy causes, but always want to make sure that people understand lead poisoning prevention actually represents a cost savings opportunity. For every dollar we spend on lead poisoning prevention, there is a $17 return. But also want to remind folks that whatever we don't spend now, we will spend later down the line. There is no cost savings for not investing now. When I say that they're more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to interact with the juvenile justice system, those things have cost. If they're not reading at grade level or ready for kindergarten, remediation and those things cost school districts, and it costs a lot more to do all of those things to invest than it does to invest on the front end. And then last slide. We can fix this, and I just don't mean in the budget by going back to the executive version for the funding and restoring the RRP version. I really want to leave things on a hopeful note for folks and want to remind folks that lead poisoning can seem like it's overwhelming and a problem that can't be fixed and something we're just going to have to deal with. And that's wrong. That is just not accurate. This is going to sound obvious, but lead poisoning happens where there's lead paint. And if we're making things lead safe, if we're doing lead abatement work, and there's not lead paint, kids aren't going to be poisoned. It's a finite issue. It will take time. It will take consistent investment, but it is a solvable problem. It is something we can actually fix. And as long as we are committed, like the legislators who are on the call with us today and who are leading the Children's Caucus, and as long as we sustain the effort, we will one day have an Ohio that is legitimately free of lead hazards for children. So with that, I will turn it back over to Representative Humphrey. And thank you all so much for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon.
Thank you, Tim. Again, just a wonderful presentation. We certainly appreciate it. At this time, I would like to turn it over to my legislative aide, Adriana Gordon, for the question and answer portion of the webinar. So Adriana, if you would like to get started on the Q&A section, please.
Thank you, Representative Humphrey. I'd like to first open the questioning to legislators and legislative aides on the call. Please, at this time, unmute yourselves and jump in with any comments, questions, or reactions. Okay, and if there's no legislators or legislative aides who would like to submit any feedback, is there anyone else on the call?
So we have a question from Joan Sporl, and I apologize if I've read your name wrong. Do you have numbers on the anticipated additional costs that come from cuts, like barriers to access food assistance actually cost money, etc.? I try to make the point of the return on investment on quality early childhood programs to make the moral and economic case.
Yeah, thank you, Joan and Kelly and Adriana. I will just state first what I should have said when I was talking about the proposals around SNAP in the budget bill is really that this is an appropriations bill, and these are policy choices that should be debated and discussed outside of this process because they're technical in nature, and we've had those discussions in past bills that have been heard in committee and not gone forward. We experienced this 2 years ago in the last biennial budget, some attempts to weaken and cut and to place additional barriers around SNAP access. And luckily we were able to defeat those attempts during the final days of the last budget process. And instead, there was a public benefits accountability task force that was established. So we've been, attending and participating, and many other advocates and including child advocates have been participating in those those hearings and sessions of the task force for many months now. We've heard how complex the system is, how technical it is, how there are a lot of IT solutions and investments that are needed, and that every additional barrier that's put in place, harms and negates access to the program, which we know ultimately just risks short and long-term health and educational outcomes for our kids, as well as, all the way up through the age bracket. So I would just encourage us to keep the budget bill a budget bill, and then let us have the policy conversations elsewhere, because that's really problematic when we're trying to make really hasty decisions about policy in a bill that's not intended for that. There was no public hearing around this, provision, in particular around the photo ID before it was inserted. So yes, we have all the research and proof under the world, and would just love the opportunity to talk about it in session and in committee.
Okay, thank you, Jory. Are there any more questions?
I see one from Chelsea Elliott. Her question is, why does this have to be advocated for? What is the opposition to resolve this saying about our state? I don't understand how anyone can say anything against the data. And Chelsea, I'm not sure if you were speaking of the lead data, is what I think, according to the timing on your question. I think you might have been speaking about the lead. So Tim, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I share that frustration sometimes, trying to you present data and you talk about all the effects that lead poisoning prevention has on children. And we've had parents, some of whom I think are actually participants in this call, talk about the issues that they've seen, and you're incredibly hopeful that reaches legislators, and you want them to fund things. Legislators all have different priorities. There are a lot of other worthy programs and things that I think legislators always want to fund. And so there's always a balancing act for them, I think, in making sure that they're trying to pay as much attention to all of the issues that they can in order to fund as much as they can. But I agree. I don't always understand why, for instance, we slashed the funding for lead poisoning prevention in the budget. There wasn't much discussion or debate around that. We had a lot of really good and productive talks with legislators. And so it's just one of those things where we continue to advocate, we continue to make legislators aware of what's happening and the downstream effects of lead poisoning prevention. and just how helpful their ongoing support is. And we will continue to do that, even if we don't get what we want in this particular budget bill. The Lead Free Kids Coalition will continue to advocate, continue to do its research, continue to bring folks down to the State House to make sure that legislators are aware of that. So certainly understand that sometimes it can be frustrating when you can present evidence and data and it still doesn't go the way that you want, but we continue to advocate and continue to fight for those things.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, if that's okay, that this is, we're in a unique position where we're not coming out of a crisis in a deficit. We have a surplus budget. We have revenue to support these critical investments. We're talking about really, really, really modest investments from, $15 million more a year to feed 2 million plus more people in Ohio. The modest investments around lead abatement, you name it. These are modest investments in comparison to the size and scope of the budget bill and the surpluses that we can do really good things with to help kids and families.
The next question comes from Susan Tebben. She is asking kind of policy or procedural questions. Any indication of how talks on the budget are going? How much impact advocates can have at this point? If it's in conference, how do advocates best get their message across to legislators? And then she also is wondering about the June 30th deadline and what happens if that deadline is missed in terms of funding delays. So if I'd be happy, if there's anyone on the call that wants to answer it, that's fine. Otherwise, I'd be happy to tell you what I know.
Would you like me to chime in?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the question. So what I would do, I'm going to start because it's multiple pieces to the question that you asked. But what I would do is I would reach out to the folks on the conference committee. So I'm a little blurry who is on the Senate side, but I know on the House side, it is going to be obviously Representative Edwards and then Representative Sweeney. Also, I know Senator Sykes is on the Senate side. I know Senator Serino is on the conference committee as well. So I say all that to say, reach out to the folks on the conference committee to get them to, hear about what your concerns are. I know specifically on the House side, children's issues are really important, which is exemplary in the budget that we did pass. So advocate to them. The other thing is tomorrow we will be voting thank you, Amy. We will be voting to extend the deadline from June 30th to like a week later. So that vote will be coming up tomorrow to be able to do that. And then what was the other question?
What would happen in terms, if the deadline is missed in terms of funding delays or other issues?
So I am blanking on that other piece, but what I will say is it will go up for a vote tomorrow, so that way we can extend the deadline. But I did see some of my other colleagues, like Senator Herschel Craig, if you would like to chime in on what happens if we miss it, because actually this is my first budget. Or Senator Coonsey. Or Tim, if you have some.
Sure. I'll just jump in really quickly and lower my hand, and I accidentally raised it by lowering it. I think that so long as they pass a continuing resolution, they will be able to continue with the funding. I have not seen the amendment that was added to the bill in House rules and reference today, so I don't know the language and what it all says. What I will say, I think for advocates, it does make us a little bit nervous and uncertain, adds uncertainty into the process when you go beyond that June 30th deadline. Not only how long it may take beyond that, but what else may be added in conference and what things may be put into the conference report and all of those things just add more uncertainty to the process. So I think we're all hoping it can get done by June 30th, but of course we will all be here and be watching anxiously as they continue to debate, deliberate, and discuss.
Okay, I believe we answered all the questions. At this time, I would like to turn it back over to Representative Humphrey.
All right, thank you, Adriana, for leading us in that Q&A section. So I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists, for those who, to all the panelists and to all of those who have tuned into the webinar. Is 69 of you who have stayed with us, so we are certainly appreciative of that. The other thing I do want to mention, as you guys know, we are soon going to be going on a 2-month break. So we want to allow everyone and ask everyone to enjoy their summers. And then the next Ohio Legislative Children's Caucus meeting will be in September. And details will follow later in the summer. So again, thank you to all the panelists for all their insight and hard work. And then also just thank you to all of the attendees for always showing up and fighting on behalf of Ohio's children. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.